Hi guys, thanks so much for coming. We're just delighted to have Jillian Tett here. Jillian was the first person that came to my mind when I was dreaming up a lecture to start off a new student group at Princeton on ethnographic methods. And so the group was just founded in the fall of this year, and it's called FIELD, which stands for Frameworks for Interdisciplinary Ethnographic Learning and Dialogue. And so what inspired me to start FIELD was having friends come to me and tell me from all different disciplines that they would love to do field work or ethnography, but they feel like they can't because they're not majoring in anthropology or sociology. So the basic purpose of FIELD is just to remind students that you don't have to major in anthropology or sociology to do field work. And to kind of sustain a conversation, have students think about how they're incorporating their fieldwork experiences along certain disciplinary frameworks. And so ultimately we hope to create a collaborative space for students, faculty, and administrators to think about how to make the university as open as it can possibly be to the research questions that are most salient to students now. And so it's kind of a dream for me to do this because I'm currently focusing on financial regulation in my own fieldwork. And I'm straddling anthropology and the Woodrow Wilson School myself in my current undergraduate curriculum. And so I think this lecture is, for me, emblematic of what collaborative work could look like. And so I really have to thank the anthropology department, the Woodrow Wilson School, the JRC program, and Otis for making this a reality, and for Professor Carol Greenhouse, the chair of the anthropology department, for agreeing to introduce Jillian. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Eudice. Congratulations to all the fields for this inaugural event, and a warm welcome to you, Gillian Tett, and thanks for joining us here today. Gillian Tett earned her BA and PhD in social anthropology from Cambridge University. Her dissertation was a study of wedding rituals, maybe anticipating the merger movement, in the former Soviet Tajikistan. Her work was supervised by a distinguished array of anthropologists, and we're going to be hearing about connecting dots across disciplines and other terrains today. She joined the Financial Times in 1993, serving as London's foreign correspondent for the former Soviet Union until 1997, and then as bureau chief for Tokyo until 2003. Her post in Japan inspired her first book, Saving the Sun, a Wall Street gamble to rescue Japan from its trillion-dollar meltdown. In 2005, in the beginning of the credit derivatives boom, Gillian Tett was appointed capital markets editor for the Financial Times. Her award-winning book, Fool's Gold, the subtitle, How Unrestrained Greed Corrupted a Dream, Shattered Global Markets, and Unleashed a Catastrophe, was based on 2 years of fieldwork with the J.P. Morgan credit derivatives team and their ideas about innovation and risk. Today, she is a leading commentator on global financial market regulation. She's been awarded the Wincott Prize, the premier British award for financial journalism, for her capital markets coverage, and the British Business Journalist of the Year award at the British Press Awards. Her book, Fool's Gold, was Financial Book of the Year in the Spears Book Award competition. We are absolutely delighted to welcome you here today, Gillian, and to thank you for serving as FIELD's inaugural lecturer. In the department, we're very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with FIELD and with our colleagues at the Wilson School, JRC, and the college. We're very grateful for FIELD's initiative and to the school for your generous hospitality. Thank you very much and welcome. May I just add that Gillian has agreed to take Q&A afterwards. When the time comes, I would just ask those of you who are not students to hold back for a few rounds to let the students ask their questions first. Thank you again.
Absolutely, great. Well, thank you very much indeed for that very kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for coming along today. I gather that I'm competing with a water party, so it's doubly nice of you to turn up. And thank you in particular to Judith for this fabulous venture. I didn't actually know what he was quite inviting me for when I agreed to come. So I've only just heard about FIELD myself. And apart from being a very clever acronym, it does indeed sound like a wonderful project. And better still, by pure serendipity, it actually chimes very well indeed with what I'm going to be talking about today. As you've just heard, I started my career or my life as an adult as a very classically trained anthropologist. I worked in Cambridge University. I went off first to Tibet and then to Tajikistan to do very classic anthropology, participant anthropology, working with a group of British anthropologists like Ernest Gellner, Caroline Humphreys, Keith Hahn, and people like that. But I've actually spent most of my career working as a financial journalist, latterly running the Financial Times' operations in America. Now, those two parts of my life have often sat rather uneasily together. In fact, when I first moved from being a social anthropologist into being a financial journalist, I have to admit that I spent the first decade of my time in journalism essentially in the closet. My colleagues who had economics PhDs were terrifically proud of that and would spend a lot of time talking about it. But I used to keep quite quiet about the fact that I had a PhD in social anthropology, because if you were covering public policy, governments, international relations, or the financial markets, the fact that you'd spent several years of your life looking at the micro-level details of Tajik wedding rituals or Tibetan monasteries didn't seem to be terribly relevant. And most people that I met out in the wide world had absolutely no idea what cultural anthropology was. They thought it was a bit like being a cultural butterfly collector, where you went around the world and collected weird artifacts. And most people couldn't really see the point of it anyway, even if they did know what it was. I was always being asked if my PhD was basically in collecting bones. And I'm sure, how many of you in the room are actually anthropologists by training? Okay, about half and half, about a third. Well, those of you who are anthropologists will know the problem of being confused with physical anthropologists. But in the last decade or so, really since 2005 or 6 in particular, I've come out of the closet with a vengeance, in the sense that I've actually realized that my training in anthropology has turned out to be a fantastically good background for trying to make sense of the world as a journalist. And I would argue not just as a journalist, it's a very good prism or filter for anybody who's trying to understand how the economy, the political system works, or even draw up public policy. So what I want to do today is talk a bit about what anthropology means to me and why I think it is so valuable, hopefully so that it can illustrate some of the questions or the issues that I grappled with before. And then I'll open it up to questions, and I'm very happy indeed to have a wider dialogue with any of you who want to challenge me or come up with thoughts or simply talk about what you do or don't think about anthropology. But I'm going to start, as is the case with most journalists, with something of a story. And the story is not actually about me. It's about an anthropologist called Pierre Bourdieu, a Frenchman, who had a tremendous influence on me when I was doing my own academic work. And actually is somebody who I've come to look at a lot more recently, partly because I'm writing another book at the moment. Now again, how many of you know about Bourdieu or have? Okay, well that's quite a good start. It's looking at some of Bourdieu's theories is part of the classic training program for anthropologists, certainly in Europe, if not in the US. But I would guess that most of you don't know much about his life. And Bourdieu is fascinating because if you were to choose one man who really encapsulates what anthropology means and why it's so valuable, and why it's so valuable today, and I will come back at the end and push it forward, Bourdieu really encapsulates it very well in terms of his own story. As you can tell, he was a Frenchman, born in 1930 in southeastern corner of France, a part of the Pyrenees that was so remote and so poor that they didn't even speak French in his native village then. They spoke a local dialect. But he was fantastically bright, and partly through sheer tenacity and hard work and intelligence, he won a scholarship to his local school, ended up in Paris, and decided that he wanted to be a brilliant French intellectual. Now, in those days, if you wanted to be a brilliant intellectual and you were French, it was very, very obvious what subject you needed to do. These days, if you want to be a brilliant American intellectual and have an impact on public policy, you become an economist. Back then in France, however, if you wanted to have an impact, the obvious thing to be was a philosopher. And not just any old philosopher, you wanted to be a disciple of Sartre, or as he said, one became a philosopher because one had been consecrated, and one consecrated oneself by securing the prestigious identity of a philosopher. This was more than ever true at a time when the entire intellectual field was dominated by the figure of Jean-Paul Sartre. And there was very much an idea that to understand the world, what you had to do was have lofty thoughts, preferably from 10,000 feet, or sitting in a French bar with a glass of red wine, and that was the way that you tried to understand the world around you, and that was how you then went on to be active in politics and society and so on. So Bourdieu went up to Paris, studied to be a philosopher, did all the first stages for having an academic career in philosophy, and then suddenly real life, or rather war, intervened. In 1955, he, like most young Frenchmen, was called up for military service. And France had just embarked on a war in Algeria. It wasn't technically called a civil war, but essentially the former French colony of Algeria was in the throes of a nascent independence movement, and young French soldiers or young French military conscripts were essentially being sent down there. Now, Bourdieu actually shouldn't have gone to Algeria. His rank qualified him as an officer, and he could have very easily been sent off to a nice, cushy life somewhere in Versailles. In fact, that's what happened to him originally. But he was a bit of a rebel and very anti-establishment, and he did all kinds of things to provoke his superiors, like turning up on training grounds, carrying lots of pacifist literature and lots of anti-colonial literature. And so to punish him, the French army sent him down to Algeria, essentially as a foot soldier. Once down there, he basically spent a rather horrid first year, surrounded by soldiers who was constantly trying to incite to revolt against their commanders, because he thought the entire colonial experience was very bad and France shouldn't be down there at all. And essentially, he got cracked down on by the army superiors quite strongly. And between sitting out in the desert with Algerian rebels essentially starting a very brutal civil war, he sat there and dreamt of his philosophy courses and was absolutely determined to get back to Paris as soon as he could and get on with what he considered to be the key task of understanding the world, i.e. to go and talk to Jean-Paul Sartre and do more philosophy. But then, after about a year out in the desert, he had a very dramatic road to Damascus type conversion. And he suddenly woke up one day. By then he was actually in Algiers, not in the desert. He woke up in his barracks and realized that actually maybe, just maybe, French philosophy was not the key to understanding the world. He could see, I don't know if anyone here is French, but apologies if you are, he could see that all around him in Algeria there was this very brutal civil war, and we are talking about extreme levels of brutality, which have become quite commonplace now in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, but back then was less known. But he could see that this war was brewing. He could see that most French people thought that the Algerians were, if not idiots or peasants, complete barbarians. And there was a great lack of interest in trying to understand why the Algerians were behaving the way they were and what made them tick. And he suddenly became consumed with this desire to get out there and try to understand them, because he thought, well, surely there must be a logic that's driving them. And he realized that actually simply sitting in his barracks reading Sartre was not actually going to offer him very much insight. He had to get out there and actually wear out his shoe leather, tramp the streets, and try to understand. So, somewhat remarkably, in the middle of this very brutal war, he did precisely that. As he said, "I wanted to tell the French people what was really going on in a country of which they knew next to nothing, in order to be some use, and perhaps also to stave off the guilty conscience of the helpless witness of an abominable war. The simple desire to observe and witness led me to invest myself in frenzied work. He was driven, he says, to measure up to war experiences of which I was the unworthy, disarmed witnesses." So, it's really starting in 1957, just as the Battle of Algiers was reaching its zenith. Bourdieu teamed up with an amazing Algerian researcher called Abdelmalek Sayed and literally went off and started to wear off the shoe leather, tramping the mountains, the streets, the roads of Algeria. And it was frankly an absolutely extraordinary thing to do. I mean, it's a bit like someone going off to serve in the US Army in Afghanistan today, getting there, saying, you know what, I don't quite understand what these Afghans are doing, but I want to get out and understand them, and literally wandering out the barracks and going forth and having a look. Not quite as dangerous, but almost as much. And unsurprisingly, Bourdieu had some pretty scary experiences, saw some quite traumatic events, and for many, many, many years, being a good buttoned-up Frenchman, this was before the era of Oprah Winfrey and the idea of bearing your soul, for many years he kept very quiet about what he'd seen. Even just before he died, when he wrote his memoirs, he still didn't really talk very much about it. He simply said, "It is not easy to describe simply situations and events that have profoundly shaken me to the point of sometimes coming back in my dreams. But my disregard for danger owed nothing to any sort of heroism, but was rooted in extreme sadness and anxiety." Now, what came out of that extraordinary tramping across Algeria in the middle of a war was really a series of very, very thoughtful portraits about Algerian society. And they were marked by techniques that, to my mind, are the hallmark of anthropology. Firstly, Bourdieu was determined to actually get out and see what was going on with his own eyes, to actually go and smell the dust, go and talk to people, watch people, listen, and just be and exist and watch. Secondly, he wasn't particularly dogmatic about what tools and techniques he used to gather that information. Although he later came to be labeled as an anthropologist, he used surveys, he teamed up with statisticians and economists, and he tried to use all kinds of creative ways to understand what was going on around him. He took a lot of photographs, actually, as well. Thirdly, he was committed to trying to understand Algerian society on its own terms and to make sense of the patterns inside it. He was absolutely convinced that if only you could understand the patterns of other societies, societies that looked irrational or strange to the outsider would start to make sense. And fourthly, he was absolutely convinced that one of the key things that anthropologists had to do was to try and get out and understand the gap between rhetoric and reality. The difference between what people say in public, the dogma, the rhetoric with which they wrap their lives, and the actual reality for how they live. And in understanding that rhetoric and reality, or the gap between them, it's not just what people say that's fascinating, it's often what they don't say that's even more important. Social silences are absolutely key. But there was a fifth aspect to what Bourdieu was doing, which was even more interesting. And that only became clear after he'd completed his first round of fieldwork in Algeria. Because after spending this year or two based in Algiers, going out and doing this fieldwork, collecting this material, publishing some fascinating works in Algeria, Bourdieu then went back to Paris. By then, he was already starting to be recognized. It was clear he wasn't going to be a philosopher, but in the sociology world, and to a degree in what then became the anthropology world, he was already earning some acclaim. And if he had wanted at that stage, he could have immediately gone off and forged a very nice career becoming a Middle Eastern expert. By then, he already spoke languages, he had a good understanding of the area, he had all the tools he needed to become an expert among French people looking at the other, i.e. Algeria. But he didn't. Instead, he decided to flip the lens in quite a dramatic fashion. And he went back to his home village in the southwest of France and decided that he wanted to go back and study where he had come from, using the perspective he'd gained in Algeria and using the fact that essentially, by being in Algeria and looking at the other, he was now able to go back to his home community with fresh eyes and try and make sense of how that community ticked, how that community worked, essentially as an outsider. And to do that, he actually did something else even more clever. He took his Algerian researcher, Abdul Malik Sayed, who'd been tramping with him across the war zone, back to southwest France, and used him as another outside pair of eyes to try and see those patterns there. And out of that extraordinary flipping of the lens came an even more interesting set of research projects. He looked at things like how the French villagers married. He looked at how they used photography. And he then went on from that initial start, that corner of France, to build out a whole series of absolutely fascinating studies about how French society worked. He looked at French food. He looked at French art. He looked at French class system, politics. He even looked at the French academic world and all of their strange tribal allegiances and tribal patterns. But the one common theme in all of this was that as he tried to flip the lens, he was using his experience of the other and being immersed in a fresh pair, in an alternative way of thinking, to then turn around and try and look back at where he came from and his society, the supposedly sophisticated, advanced world of France, and try to understand what made that tick. And that essentially was not just his hallmark, but in many ways, some of the hallmarks of anthropology at its best. As I say, what Bourdieu was doing, and what I think cultural anthropology at its best does, is not just use the techniques of grassroots research, of bottom-up research, not just look at the gap between rhetoric and reality, not just look at how elites use rhetoric to maintain their power structures, and not just take a holistic view of how societies work, which is very important, but he also tried to use the process of traveling, either physically or mentally, to look back at where he came from with fresh eyes and try and see how it all hung together. So, apologies for those of you who already have studied Bourdieu all your lives. You probably know all that already. But I think in many ways it's a story that's not widely known, and it does encapsulate what the power of anthropology is. And for many decades since, I'm proud to say, delighted to say, that universities on both sides of the Atlantic have been practicing various forms of anthropology, either along the lines of Bourdieu or by drawing on other fabulous American anthropologists, even a few British anthropologists, and trying to practice this idea of participant observation and trying to make sense of cultures and societies in a holistic way. And much of that analysis and research has been incredibly insightful, usually not quite as dramatic as the work of Bourdieu, but very, very valuable, and frankly, something that society at large and public policy makers at large should be lauding, celebrating, and paying attention to. And yet, the reality is that, as I started off by saying, for the most part, in the last few decades, the tragedy, the waste is that actually cultural anthropology, the work of people like Bourdieu and all of his American counterparts, hasn't been as widely known as the work of many economists. It hasn't had the kind of impact that is often deserved. And for the most part, if you are a rookie journalist like I was, starting out in a career in financial journalism, most of the people who you're likely to meet are not likely to have heard of Bourdieu and not likely to know what an anthropologist is. We in the anthropology world, and I still consider myself to be part of that on a sort of part-time basis, we in the anthropology world have to recognize that however brilliant our internal insights have been, however valuable the research, the level of impact it's had on society more widely and the level of respect it's commanded has certainly not been all that it could have been. It's certainly not been the kind of level of respect that either French philosophers commanded back in the 1940s or that economists command today. Why is that? Well, to my mind, there are probably three key issues there. One of them, ironically, is the nature of the anthropology endeavor itself. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the French anthropologist with whom Bourdieu didn't really quite work, he more competed, but they've moved around in each other's orbit. But Lévi-Strauss once observed that one of the issues about anthropologists is they tend by nature to be fairly anti-establishment. Most anthropologists spend so much time thinking about power structures that they end up with pretty cynical views of how power works. They tend to think that politics is all rather grubby. They think that money is definitely grubby. And they tend to be rather disinclined to spend their time playing the game with the organs and institutions of power in the way that is actually needed. At the same time, anthropologists are trained by nature of at least their classic training, the sort that I underwent, to spend their time being observers, not speakers. Anthropologists are trained to sit there and watch quietly rather than take over or seize the floor, as I'm doing right now. And I often used to joke with my fellow anthropology colleagues in London, in Cambridge, that basically most of us were happiest when we were sitting in the bushes watching other people rather than actually grabbing center stage. And sitting in the bushes is a fabulous way to do research. Frankly, there aren't enough people in the world who sit in the bushes and watch, or not in academic communities. But unfortunately, it's not a very good way to make your voice heard or to actually insert yourself in the public policy debate. And it's very interesting to think a bit about the contrast between anthropologists and, say, economists. Because I've not met many economists who like to sit in the bushes. Most of them actually prefer to be out there presenting their point of view and talking. And most of them are actually very, very good at working the organs of power and actually embracing and dealing with the institutions. And I don't say that with any kind of moral judgment at all. You know, I'm full of admiration for the way that economics as a discipline has seized so many of the channels of power. But there is a very interesting cultural distinction between the way that anthropology departments often work and the way that economics departments often work. Just as philosophers ruled the roost in France 50 years ago, economists are often in that cultural position too within the system in a place like America today. Another reason why anthropologists tend to not get the focus or credit that they deserve, I think, is that irrespective of whether anthropologists want to actually engage and actually get their voices heard, for the most part, they face an uphill struggle because wider society for the last few decades has not always been very interested in listening to what they have to say. One of the big changes that's occurred in the last 3 or 4 decades, not just in the financial world, but particularly in the financial and political world, has been the rise of the number and the nerd. In particular, as computing power has spread, disciplines like economics, and by default to a degree other parts of social sciences, have increasingly become enthralled to the idea of crunching numbers to understand how the world works. I used to joke that on Wall Street, if you couldn't put a variable into a spreadsheet, then frankly, most people weren't that interested. There was a very strong assumption that the way that the world worked could be shaped, controlled, predicted through numbers. Soft, hippie issues like social anthropology or the kind of issues that anthropologists study often were rather disregarded. And that went hand in hand with an assumption that actually technology was key, technology was all powerful, and that again, the more machines you had, the more numbers you had, the social factor, the human factor, was less interesting. But having explained to you why, in many ways, I think social anthropology has faced an uphill struggle in getting its voice heard, getting these very valuable insights heard, the one thing that I do think is very encouraging is that in many ways, anthropology today is potentially at a great turning point, or potentially at a great opportunity moment. Because for a number of reasons, although these skills and these insights that have come out of the anthropology world have been struggling to get themselves heard, the world is actually in a moment of flux. And I think there are at least 5 reasons why, if anthropologists became more proactive, they could actually be seizing more of the public debate and actually seizing more of the discussion and getting their voice heard more effectively. One reason is that, if nothing else, we've learnt from the financial crisis that macroeconomics can be a wonderful discipline in some spheres, but can also be very, very limited when it's marked by tunnel vision. Numbers don't always tell the story. And the idea that computing power and algorithms could predict the future with great accuracy has been very much upended in the last 5 years. One sign of that is the fact that even in classic economics departments, issues like behavioral finance are becoming increasingly fashionable, as even classic macroeconomists start to realize that man is fundamentally a social beast. People don't always behave quite like rational market theories would imply, and that looking at the so-called social factor is not simply very useful, it's also very essential. One small example of that, which I was talking to people in Washington about the other day, is that, this is by way of illustration, before 2007, the rating agencies and the Fed had a very clear-cut model for how default rates in America were supposed to work. And when they developed their models for predicting what was going to happen to subprime mortgage securities and things like that, they tended to assume that human beings would behave in a fairly mechanistic way. In particular, they tended to assume that what had happened in the past could be extrapolated to the future and would enable you to make good predictions about default rates. And what had happened in the past was that essentially most households in America, when they came under financial pressure, had defaulted on their debts in a particular order. And the order was that first you defaulted on your credit cards, then you defaulted on your car, and lastly you defaulted on your house. And that was essentially the pattern that was plugged into all the models. Then came the mortgage boom of 2005 and 2006, and that pattern began to change. And if you'd been an anthropologist working for the Fed back then, or working for the rating agencies, and actually spent some time doing what Bourdieu did, and getting out into housing communities, and actually talking to people who had loans, you would have realized pretty easily, and pretty rapidly, that something rather radical was changing in the way that humans were behaving. Most notably, when they started to come under pressure in 2007, instead of defaulting first on their credit cards, people started to default first on their houses, then on their car, and then lastly on their credit card. The order actually switched. And that, in many ways, was an entirely rational change in behavior, because actually, after 2007, the social penalties for defaulting on your house were not that high. And in America, it's almost impossible to have any kind of social or economic life without a credit card. And if you lost your house, you can always sleep in your car. Seriously. So if you think about it, it actually was rational. And if people had gone out and actually looked at what was happening on the ground and tried to join up the dots and looked at the gap between rhetoric and reality and taken a holistic view, then they would have seen it pretty quickly. But of course, nobody did before 2007 because there was that great faith in numbers. And so the happy segue to that story is, having been so dramatically upended by the fact the models stopped working, inside the Fed, inside the Treasury, inside some of the rating agencies, post-2007, there is at least now a recognition that sometimes numbers don't always tell the whole story. And in that recognition, I would say there's also an opportunity for anthropologists to stand up and talk. A second reason why, in some ways, this is a great moment of opportunity for anthropology is that, I think, another consequence of 2007 is that there's a growing awareness of the problem of silos. I've spoken about this quite a bit in the last couple of years, and I'm actually writing a book at it right now, so I'm not going to talk about it in too much detail. But essentially, one of the great paradoxes of the 21st century is that we live in communities and systems which are increasingly interconnected in terms of the fact that if you have a shock in one corner, it's transmitted very rapidly across the system to another corner. So we're interconnected in some ways, and yet, structurally and cognitively, we're very fragmented, in the sense that most of us exist in little silos and are scurrying around doing our stuff in our own little group, with very limited understanding of what's happening across the other silos or across the system as a whole. We are constantly being upended by surprises about something that's happened in another corner of the system that has the ability to affect us, but which we don't understand, because either we're marked by tunnel vision and we're just looking at the world through our own little discipline, our own political group, or our own social group, or because essentially we're scurrying around in our own little department without much awareness of what's happening elsewhere. And if you go back to why macroeconomics essentially suffered such a comeuppance in the 2007 crisis, and why it was that people like the Fed weren't going out and wearing out the shoe leather and looking at what was happening on the ground in subprime communities, it's partly because they were trapped in their own mental silo. They had their own tunnel vision, in the sense that they were only looking at the numbers. They only knew about what they knew about. They weren't taking a wider, holistic view of how societies and economies worked. However, I think that precisely because the world is becoming more complex, because shocks are being transmitted, and because of events like 2008, there is an awareness of the need to conduct more holistic, interdisciplinary research of the sort that Judy's talked about. And once again, that's an area where anthropology has a lot to offer, because the hallmark of anthropology is that you go out into communities like Bourdieu did, you tramp the streets, you look at all aspects of how our society works and try and knit it together. Third point, another change in the world today is that policymakers, investors, business leaders, maybe to a degree ordinary voters, are increasingly realizing that we do live in a very globalized world and that we do need to take notice of other cultures and try and understand them on their own terms. In my day job as a journalist, I spend a lot of time talking to American companies and American CEOs. And if you dial back 2 or 3 decades, it's noticeable that a number of CEOs in America used to have a mental map of the world that essentially was binary. You had America, and then you had what you called ROW, rest of the world. And a bit like the British Empire 200 years ago, you kind of assumed that the ROW box was kind of a bit weird, that they would eventually grow up and become like us, i.e. American, or 200 years ago, Imperial Britain. And you assumed that you kind of vaguely needed to know what they were up to because you probably wanted to sell them products, but you didn't need to spend too much time worrying about their rhythm because actually there was a sense that, hey, they were just the ROW. Now, one thing that's become very clear post-2007 and 2008 is that the ROW matters enormously. These days, if you look at the macroeconomy, it's the Chinese who have the money. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, is where a lot of the economic growth is, where a lot of the economic power increasingly lies. They're the creditors. They can't just be ignored. They can't be patronized. On the contrary, most American CEOs these days are obsessed with trying to work out how to sell more products into that part of the world and how to understand them on their own terms, increasingly on their own terms. And if you go to companies ranging from Microsoft to Procter & Gamble, almost anywhere else, you'll find teams of people inside these companies who are trying to understand how other cultures operate and how they're different. Even inside America, there's a growing recognition, one might argue a very belated recognition, that not everybody is a WASP, not everybody can be sold to or treated the same way. Cultural difference, ironically, at an age when we appear to be increasingly integrated by virtue of a common cultural channels and internet, cultural difference is very much there as an issue. And so, again, that creates an opportunity. As some of you who are anthropologists will know, the American government, the CIA, has been a big employer of anthropologists over the years. That's not something that the anthropology community feels exactly proud of or wants to advertise, and it's something which is very controversial. But these days, a number of big companies are employing anthropologists too in all manner of roles. Again, it's something that's pretty controversial within the academic community, but it does at least signal that there is an opportunity there for people who want to talk about cultural difference. And then last but not least, another area of great opportunity lies with the very issue that in some way pushed aside the issue of social sciences over the last few decades, namely technology, and in particular, big data. Now, at first glance, the rise of big data, the rise of computing power, the rise of the ability of computer geeks and scientists to try and analyze the world through big data and tools and algorithms, which seem to make anthropology, the type of techniques that Bourdieu was using, less and less relevant. I'm sure most of you are aware of these statistics, but the amount of data that we're all throwing up as a society has increased exponentially over the last couple of years, and with it has the ability for computer geeks and scientists to try and make sense of it. And these days, there is an exploding industry of people out there, both inside academia and outside academia, who are trying to find ways to track the way that we behave and make sense of it and crunch the numbers, and use that to not just inform corporate policies, but also public policy as well, and to essentially help our understanding of the world. As I say, in some ways, this would appear to be a sign that actually social sciences, people who look at the human factor, are becoming less relevant. But actually, if you talk to data scientists these days, and people who are engaged in using these numbers and looking at these numbers, something rather curious is going on, which is that as the business of data science grows in scale and scope, and grows in resources too, increasingly, many of the data scientists begin to realize that they actually need the social component once again. In fact, in some ways, they need the social component more than ever before. The reason is that what data science is doing these days is in some ways offering a rather interesting third way in terms of how we make sense of the world. For the last few decades, essentially, if you wanted to understand the world, you had a choice of two things to do, or three things to do if you count philosophy as well. You could either sit there and look at the world from 30,000 feet in general terms and talk about general behavior of economies or general behavior of populations and try and understand it that way in a fairly abstract manner. Or you could get down and get dirty and do what anthropologists do and actually go out and eyeball people on an individual level. You either did the micro and you wore out the shoe leather, like Pierre Bourdieu, or you did the macro and tried to come up with grandiose economic theories, number crunching, philosophical musings, or whatever, and tried to understand the world that way. What's happening with data science, big data today, is that the sheer amount of data that's coming out of the system and being collected, and the ability of computers to actually crunch those numbers means that increasingly data scientists can start looking at micro behavior with much more detail and texture than they could in the past. You don't have to be an anthropologist or an ethnographer and go out and eyeball people to understand what people are doing at a community level or an individual level. You can actually build up a very complex, subtle, three-dimensional portrait of personal behavior at the micro level by collecting the numbers. Now, in some ways, as I say, that would imply that anthropologists aren't needed. However, there's a catch. And Genevieve Bell, who works at Intel, who may be known to some of you, she's an anthropologist who works for Intel, she puts it very well. She says that the key thing about data these days is that data looks like numbers, but actually it's always a social construct. And the reason is that data is always collected somewhere by a human being. Even if it's a machine, it's been designed by a human being. It's then manipulated by human beings in the sense that humans create the codes, the programs that then sort the data, and they inevitably input their own biases. And then it's interpreted and handled by human beings. And if you try to pretend that the social aspect doesn't matter, then you're simply fooling yourself. And more importantly, when it comes to interpreting and creating policies on the back of big data, again, that human aspect really matters. And it's not just Genevieve Bell as an anthropologist sitting inside a big data company, i.e. Intel, who's saying this. I've been spending quite a bit of time recently talking to people at MIT and talking to various West Coast universities and West Coast companies about this. And almost anyone you speak to in the number crunching quant world these days will tell you that they are desperate for people who both have the ability to crunch the numbers, deal with algorithms, and have the social overlay as well, or the social realization as well. In fact, a number of universities are now considering creating essentially social science data mining courses to try and bring these two areas together. Now, many traditional anthropologists like me, who were trained in the School of Participant Observation, might say, well, that's kind of all a bit far off the beat of what anthropology is about. Anthropology is about going into a community, sitting there observing, conducting field work. It's not really about getting a degree in computer sciences and manipulating numbers. But there again, if you go back to someone like Pierre Bourdieu, who took a very eclectic view to what tools he used to try and make sense of the world, who wasn't scared of using statistics, surveys, and then combining that with a lot of theoretical analysis and simple participant observation. If you look back to him, I'm quite sure that somebody like him, were he alive today, would have absolutely seized on the opportunity of big data and tried to find ways to pull these two tools together and tried to find ways to essentially use the insights into the social to make sense of the world. So, by way of conclusion, I just say that there are many reasons to feel a bit frustrated with the discipline of anthropology and the fact that it has not had more recognition or more awareness in recent decades. There are also many reasons to feel incredibly proud of what it can offer as a tool for looking at the world. And perhaps, a little naively, but I like to be an optimist, there are also many reasons to feel very excited about what anthropology can do today, not just inside universities, but outside universities too. In my own small way, as a journalist, I very much try to bring my anthropology training, that prism, about taking a holistic view, looking at rhetoric and reality, looking at power structures, and flipping the lens. I've tried to use that in my own journalism, and I just say by way of conclusion that I wish you all the very best of luck in finding ways to use it in your own work, in whatever field you might be. So thanks very much indeed for listening. Very happy to take questions. And I don't know how the tradition goes here, whether you want to have people come up to the microphone, but please do.
Hello, and thank you for coming. First, I just wanted to ask, you said in 2005 or 2006 you came out as an anthropologist career-wise, and I was just wondering, we understand how in 2007 and 2008 that perspective was helpful, but was there anything, or what was it that kind of made you be more open about your background as an anthropologist in the workplace?
Well, what really made me want to talk more about anthropology was a realization of the degree to which finance had been not just dominated by this obsession with numbers and this tunnel vision, but essentially was missing the big picture. And, I mean, bizarrely, these days, if you read my Wikipedia bio or whatever, I'm credited with being one of the few who spotted the looming credit crunch. I mean, I think that's kind of a bit ridiculous, because all I did was go out into the financial world as a quasi-anthropologist, ask a lot of questions about lots of different parts of finance, try and join up the dots, and essentially do a reprise of my fieldwork in Tajikistan inside Wall Street in the City of London. And if you did that and broke out of the tunnel vision of bankers or economists, it was incredibly obvious that there was a yawning gap between rhetoric and reality in finance in 2005 and 2006. It was very obvious that the official mantra and dogma of finance was essentially supporting the power structure and didn't actually match what was going on the ground. And it was very obvious that the kind of models that bankers were using were often very naive. And I just cite this issue about mortgage defaults as merely one of many, many examples which were afoot then. So that's what really prompted me to start talking more openly about social sciences and anthropology.
Thank you.
So thanks for the very excellent talk, really excellent. I'd like to expand further on the anthropology of economists. Inasmuch as that particular species has, I suspect, a unique axe to grind, in that the very notion of rationality, which derives from 17th century, 18th century philosophers, is, I suspect, designed to support the idea that human beings are uniquely different from all other animals in all respects, and that this has to be validated as a cultural construct. When I look at some behavioral economics, and I should hasten, I'm a neurobiologist by training, I fail totally to see any basis for rationality and look at practical ways that decision-making is being affected. So in part, I'd refer to, let's say, you probably know John Coates' book, Hour Between Dog and Wolf, and so on, and which is, I think, a very good representation of the micro events that occur. But the macro events, I'm asking for your insights on economists, seem to hold on sort of a quasi-religious basis, a belief set that is not fundamentally tested, because the social science model does not provide equations that can be used in predictive manner. There are simply too many variables. So Galton instead should be pulled to the fore rather than quants. So without giving my own talk, let me stop there and ask you to comment, please.
Well, I mean, you put your finger on a brilliant point, which is that, the finance industry needed the illusion of certainty and precision to sell products. And so, it seized on a branch of economics, which was, orthodox economics, free market economics, Chicago School, this concept of rational man, particularly from the 1970s onwards, and built out this whole financial industry, which had its sort of theoretical underpinnings, if you like, on this idea of rational man and man behaving in a consistent fashion without any reflexivity, and essentially built on the assumption that human behavior and human economic behavior could be understood using tools borrowed from the world of physics and mathematics. And ironically, when finance really exploded and imported those tools in the 1980s, they imported a branch of Newtonian physics, very simplistic Newtonian physics, that had kind of gone out of fashion about 100 years before in the academic world, and yet became the vision which imbued so much of sort of modern economic financial thinking, completely ignored all the kind of more subtle forms of all the modern physics and mathematics that was out there. And unsurprisingly, it has suffered badly in terms of its impact or its lack of predictive powers, and the fact that when the world is fairly stable, people do behave in ways that they've behaved before, and the past can sometimes be quite a good predictor of the future for short periods of time when there is stability. But when there are shocks, you tend to break that, and you get what George Soros calls reflexivity, and human beings and markets react to each other and no longer behave in a consistent fashion, or no longer behave like individual atoms unrelated from each other. I mean, something I used to find fascinating was, the oddity of finance borrowing Newtonian physics on such a same degree, but also the fact that, such was the level of tunnel vision and, blink thinking driven by expediency that, back in 2005 and 6, the industry couldn't even see the contradictions within its own philosophy when it came to economics. And there are two particular examples I'd give of that. One is that when the financial industry was producing complex financial products like CDOs, they used to constantly justify this in terms of the quest for the perfect free market. And there was this very strong idea that if you could make all financial assets tradable, liquid, then you'd get the perfect free market where risk would be allocated in exactly the right place, and the prices would reflect supply and demand perfectly, and that would be a very good thing. So essentially, products like CDOs were developed very much under the mantra of market completion. The bitter, terrible irony was that by 2006, many of the CDOs, the collateralized debt obligations that banks were pumping out, were so unbelievably complex that actually it was entirely impossible to trade them at all. And the majority of them were being created, placed on a bank's books, and then just sitting there and not trading. And in fact, it was so completely impossible to trade them that there weren't even any market prices for these instruments. The hedge funds and banks had to use model prices, i.e. use computer models to get a price to input inside their accounting system. So you had an accounting system based on free market ideas, mark-to-market ideas. You had products which were being created with the goal of market completion, and yet you also had an entire swathe of the financial system which was not actually trading, and yet somehow nobody actually spotted this contradiction. As I say, Bourdieu would have walked in a second into a Wall Street bank and said, hang on a sec, there's a big gap here between rhetoric and reality, and guess what? The rhetoric is serving someone's interests. But hey, there weren't many anthropologists sitting on Wall Street banks' desks back then, so no one spotted it. Second tiny example, briefly, is if you go back to Adam Smith, who is cited as a great prophet, which somehow legitimizes so much of the American capitalist vision today, and you go back and say, what was it inside in Adam Smith's vision that made capitalism work? Three things. One, overlapping ownership of companies and management, i.e. the people who run a company should also own it. Two, free access to markets. And three, free price information. That's what you need to make capitalism work, to make free markets work. All three of those ingredients were missing on Wall Street in 2006. You had shareholders who were useless and managers who were basically running the show. You had anything but free access to markets because much of the complex financial sector was essentially run by big cartels of banks. And you had anything but free access to price information because you couldn't get a price of a CDO if you wanted, if you were outside the system. And yet, Wall Street carried on flying the flag of Adam Smith, even as it contravened it. So, long-winded answer to your question, but I hope that sort of answers some of it.
Hi. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm actually a PhD student in anthropology here at Princeton, and I'm very sympathetic to the overall arc of what you're saying about the fact that decision makers and the public at large should be more aware of the insights that anthropologists have, and I think Pierre Bourdieu is, you're right to point out, a great example of that. I guess my question is, if you could perhaps clarify how that would be possible, because essentially anthropologists produce work like books and articles for which they get their jobs that are very much attuned to complexity, and that's what other individuals, other colleagues of theirs find to be of value. And I think that those texts are usually not that, are not for the general public in a sense.
Reader-friendly?
Right. And so the other thing is that a lot of anthropologists also are very attuned to power and to this divide between rhetoric and reality that you've talked about. And when you become very attuned to that, you usually become, I think, more cynical rather than, as you said, going along with the institutions. Now, the people who also choose to become anthropologists are also the kind of people who don't want to just saddle up to institutions and actually want to see what's going on with them or why they're not working or why they're doing something that they claim that they shouldn't be. So essentially, how would anthropology overcome those things? And I think, and maybe if you can clarify this by explaining whether you think that the world at large should just appreciate anthropologists more, or if anthropologists actually need to change what they do to be heard in a particular way. And if they do so, would they not in some way undermine or dilute or something negative to what they in fact already do?
I think you put it brilliantly, and that is the fundamental big dilemma. Because as you say, the very traits that make anthropology so valuable, are actually quite fragile traits. The ability to sit quietly and listen, the ability to try and recognize there are no easy black and white answers or explanations and to be subtle, and the ability to not be dogmatic and to try and be open, in a sense humble, is one of the things that is remarkable about anthropology. I gave a speech 2 years ago to EPIC, which is a business anthropology conference group. And they put up a slide on the board which was absolutely mind-blowing because it was a survey of anthropologists, and it asked how many of the anthropologists thought that they were fairly paid. And something like 70% of the anthropologists thought they were fairly paid. Whereas if you asked economists that, you get like 2%, because, and I'm not slagging off economists, but it's about an issue of, life choices and what matters. And those are the qualities that make anthropology valuable, and they are qualities that are in danger of being lost when anthropologists basically engage with the world and try to promote their ideas. And I'm very clear-sighted that, what I do as a journalist these days is not anthropology. I do everything I can to champion the cause of anthropology and to try and get people to understand it. I have in the past had some very rude emails from real anthropologists who say, how dare you use the label of anthropologist given that you've kind of gone into pop culture. I don't think writing for the FT is quite pop culture, but and you're basically trivializing, simplifying, in some way sensationalizing anthropology. How dare you? That's terrible. To which I would say, well, okay, you can, you can say that if you like, but, unless there is some way to bridge anthropology and actually make it engage with the wider world, and unless anthropologists get, or at least some anthropologists become better at working with other disciplines and trying to actually be of the world, not, not simply observing the world, but be of the world, then frankly, many of the brilliant insights in anthropology may never get out of their own little silo and may in a sense get wasted. It's a controversial thing to say, but, I think that would be a tragedy. So what I would say is that, in the world of anthropology, there will be some people who only ever want to be academics and only ever want to sit in the bushes, fantastic. There will be some, like me, who want to go out and engage with the world. And those, like me, who do want to go out and engage with the world, don't forget your anthropology. And please, those who remain in the bushes, don't slag them off. Do recognize what they're doing. And let's try and work out a way, if you like, to have a spectrum of people who are working with relative levels of purity, if you like, in anthropology, and at least try to get both the discipline to preserve what's precious, but also find ways to use it in places other than anthropology departments. That's what I'd say personally. But, you know, I've had this conversation at AAA meetings, which are the American Anthropological Association, and, you know, there's a great spectrum of people today in the anthropology world. You know, many anthropologists think it is absolutely disgusting that anybody would ever work for the American government or work for a corporation. Some of them think it's pretty, you know, questionable to even be working for a newspaper, because, you know, working for a newspaper, you do simplify stories, you do, in a sense, sacrifice part of the truth to try and communicate things quickly to a wide group of people. But there are also many anthropologists who are trying to find ways to bridge that gap.
Yeah, well, I'm way out of my field. I thought AAA was a car club. When you talk about the unworkable and bizarre financial instruments such as the CDOs and the credit swaps that the banks constructed, to what extent would you credit the government policies of, some of them say, forcing them to accept subprime mortgages to the instruments that they created to protect themselves against them, even if they were bizarre and unworkable?
Oh, government policies were crucial. Not so much in terms of the government, you know, the government was devising policies to try and fix short-term problems or, you know, meet political goals without thinking about the long-term distorting consequences. But the real issue is that you have a financial industry which is entirely incentivized to find loopholes and arbitrage opportunities, discrepancies, and to spot crazy short-term policies and take advantage of it. And so whenever you have, you know, intervention in the mortgage markets by the government for political ends, as in the subprime world, the financial industry will, you know, spring up and try to find ways to essentially trade that. And that's what was going on. So yes. I mean, you know, Fannie and Freddie are crazy. Again, you know, exhibit number 3, you know, America is founded on this idea of free market capitalism, and yet the mortgage market is, you know, almost entirely government underpinned. And, you know, there are not many people who stand up and say, you know, well, hang on a sec, if you're going to have this free market, you know, rhetoric, how come the housing sector, which is such a core part of the financial system and so directly involved in people's lives, how come that is government underpinned? You know, 9/10 of mortgages today in America are essentially underwritten by the government.
I wanted to say I really appreciate your column and appreciated your lecture, so I'm very glad that I came. I'm a recycled PhD in history, and so I know a little bit about the social reaction when you do something out of the academic mainstream. But I do have a question about...
I'd love to know what a recycled PhD means, but anyway.
Well, it would take too long to explain. I have been, among other things, I have been an editor of anthropology books, a few anthropology books, so I know a little bit. But my question is really this. I really appreciate what you're saying about how more knowledge on the ground about people's mentalities, their behavior, their values, could have prevented the disastrous meltdown that we've seen. However, I also saw a really wonderful film about a financial fraudster named Michael Berger. I don't know if you're familiar with that case, but Berger was an Austrian who ran a hedge fund and who saw that just the sorts of things you were talking about, and so he bet very heavily that that housing market was going to collapse. The problem was, though, that he ran out of money before he was really able to, before the market turned, and he took the wrong course and is a fugitive from justice now in Austria as a kind of mini Madoff. So the problem that I see, the problem I wanted to ask about is this. With all of the insight that you might get from that kind of field work on the ground, from a holistic understanding of behavior, I think the problem in Wall Street really is that these people had been making money hand over fist. And if somebody went to their boss and said, hey, look, I have some really interesting data, maybe something from Big Beta, maybe a report from an anthropologist who says, look, people aren't going to behave like this, what the boss would have said is, you're right. This field work really has supplied something that we have lacked, so we're going to change our course. But I think what really happens is, no, we've had profits quarter after quarter. Yes, in principle this is right, but we can't afford to get out of this early. We have to stay in it and just pray that we're going to be able to get out of it in time.
Well, the reality is that back in 2006, very few people had any incentive to rock the boat and to stop the gravy train. And when Chuck Brint said, as long as the music is playing, we're dancing, he captured the spirit of many, many people. One of the most fascinating studies I've seen recently actually came out of partly a Princeton economist working with a couple of other economists who looked at what bankers involved in the business of securitizing mortgages did with their own money between 2005 and the present. And it's amazing that they could do this. I mean, this really is the power of big data. But they managed to go to something called the American Securitization Forum, get a list of the attendees in 2006 at the annual conference, pick 400 at random of the mid-level bankers who were actually engaged in securitizing these assets, track, by virtue of big data, their own mortgage dealings and real estate dealings from 2005 onwards. I mean, it's amazing you can get this data, but apparently you can. And then work out whether they had made or lost money on real estate transactions themselves with their own money. And then by way of comparison, they got 400 equity analysts on Wall Street who were not tracking housing stocks, and they got 400 lawyers who were wealthy and professional, but again, not involved in securitization. And I say, it has come out of Princeton, this study. It turns out that the mortgage securitization experts did quite a bit worse than the lawyers. They lost quite a lot of money. They bought properties in crazy places like California, and those properties all suffered, a sharp decline in values. And they actually didn't do any better than the other equity analysts. And the moral of the story was that the people who were involved in this industry in 2006, there were a few people who were mad and greedy and perhaps evil, but for the majority of them, they were simply swept along by groupthink and tunnel vision. And it comes back to my point again about silos. Such was the tunnel vision, such was a silo in which they were operating professionally, and such was their lack of anthropology training that they themselves got suckered to.
Thank you.
If anyone wants that reference, it's a really good paper. I mean, Princeton should be proud of it.
I'd just like to have your comments. The scientific community can develop all kinds of information that can be used, and we'll assume they can give you all of it. How does that relate now to the government and the people who control the government on legislation? And when there is legislation that comes up that could help prevent some of this, it's usually watered down so much that there's nothing left. To me, it seems like we have too much of the very, very wealthy or plutocrats controlling too much of what is really happening and getting whatever they really want. And I don't see, I'm just wondering how much the scientific community can put their will on changing some of this.
Well, it's tough, is the answer. I mean, the growing gap between the 1% and 99% is not just about an economic gap, it's also about an ability to operate the levers of power and to have access to knowledge and information and influence. And it's tough. You know, in an ideal world, things like big data would be a tremendously liberating force. And there's a group at MIT, you know, these days who would argue that big data should be part of the Creative Commons and that it should be something that we all have access to and have the ability to use to better understand the world and to try and, you know, get involved with public policy issues. In reality, that has not happened yet. And, you know, what really worries me is the fact that, going back to my issue of silos and our system being connected and having the ability to transmit shocks, and yet cognitively very fragmented, what worries me is that, you know, as technologies become more complex, time and again you have experts, technological experts or elites or geeks, if you like, scurrying around doing something that nobody else understands, even though it affects us all. And finance was one example of that, where essentially you had people doing stuff with CDOs that nobody else understood, but which ended up blowing up the entire system. You know, medicine is another example of that today. There are many areas in science in the world around us where essentially, you know, the geeks are doing things that no one else understands. And the real challenge is how do you get oversight of those technical silos? How do you ensure that essentially there is some fair split of power? And, you know, I don't have easy answers to that, other than thank heavens for universities like Princeton, where you do actually have people who can try and take a holistic view and speak out.
Last question. Well, I actually wanted, thank you for coming, and I'm an FT addict, and I'm spending all day trying to figure out the new app, which just got released. But I have a question actually about the news business, and it has to do with the receptiveness of different news organizations to anthropological approaches. Given what I do, I deal a lot with media folks, and I always know when I get a call from an FT reporter or from most European journalists that most of them have learned languages, lived places, know stuff in depth. And as you know, most of the American media switch out their journalists. They think it's important not to stay too long in one place, not to build up, you know, too many local ties. And so I'm wondering, you know, if you have this approach, which it seems to me a number of the European papers and particularly the FT, you know, do, that it's a good idea for somebody to actually know something in depth, which is a sort of anthropological approach. It produces a different kind of journalism. So I'm wondering, seeing this from the outside, whether you think that different news organizations are differently receptive to a kind of anthropological, learn languages, live places, know stuff in depth kind of approach, and whether that has a downside, right? Because the American journalists always say, fresh eyes. You get fresh eyes on problems all the time, and you see different things. So I'm wondering, A, whether you think there are these different journalistic cultures, and B, whether an anthropological approach is a good thing or has weaknesses.
Well, I'm surprised to hear you characterize it like that, because actually something like the FT does rotate, you know, a group like we do rotate people. So, you know, in my own career, I've worked in Europe, Japan, you know, I've covered all manner of different beats. You know, I've done a lot of different things, partly because we have traditionally believed very strongly that, you know, if somebody becomes too deeply immersed in a topic that they can't see what an ordinary person would spot straight away, then they're not going to make a very good journalist in the sense of not communicating it in a manner that readers could understand. But, you know, I appreciate that, you know, papers and cultures vary enormously, and I'm delighted to hear if you think that European journalists are more knowledgeable. I mean, I'm not sure the British media right now quite has that reputation, given the hacking scandals, but great. I don't want to disabuse you. The real problem in the media today is resources, 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 because to do in-depth analysis requires money. And the more that media organizations are under financial pressure, the more they are being incentivized to streamline and to focus only on areas and issues that will produce a quick hit or a quick story, a return for their investment. And the more that they lose the ability to have slack in the system or people who can just wander. And that is a really big problem, because when you streamline your resources, and focus it on areas where you'll get a quick return, you get trapped into silos very fast. And you use your ability to have fresh, creative thinking or to simply silo bust. And, that's one of the dangers that's right across the media world right now, and for which I don't have an easy answer, other than to either encourage the population to pay a lot more for their news, to get the government more involved in terms of subsidizing the media, which is not going to happen in America, or to hope for a new class of liberal, socially minded media tycoons to stand up and back newspapers and other organs and be willing to lose money.